we can probably get started. So welcome to one more class of Enterprise Application Integration. Just a quick reminder regarding classes. If you remember from the syllabus and from the first class, I told you that on the 16th of October, so next week, there will be no class, so you don't have to come. Okay. But there's going to be a makeup class on the following Wednesday, which means 21st of October. Of course, I know that some of you have classes, and if you have classes, you may go to your classes or you may come to this class. In any case, as you know, we tape all the classes, so it's going to be made available. In any case, if you can come, please do come, because we are going to keep on talking about web services and second-generation web services. So remember, no class next Friday. Okay. What are we going to talk about today? We are going to talk... Come on in. We are going to be talking about two different things. Paul Merson gave you a nice introduction last week about service-oriented architecture. We are going to talk a little bit about service-oriented architecture today, more from an enterprise application integration perspective. And then we are going to start to discuss the technologies that enable you to create a service-oriented architecture. And that means that we are going to look at web services quite in a few details. So you may actually you may have got a little bit confused about what Paul was saying and what I call the service-oriented architecture in the class that I taught. And one of the things that you should realize is that Paul was talking in generic terms about what a service-oriented architecture can be. I was telling you about a service-oriented architecture from an enterprise application integration perspective, which means that I'm not talking about creating an application silo or something that is very confined. I'm talking mostly about integrating systems and how to do it with a service-oriented architecture. And in that case, the definition that I'm using and the type of architecture that I'm presenting you, it's what's called the hub and spoke architecture, which was one of the architectures that Paul also covered. So, in a nutshell, the type of service-oriented architectures that people use for enterprise application integration, in general, have an enterprise service bus where basically somehow you publish a number of services that you have available. These services are quite coarse-grained, which means that in general they have operations that represent aggregates in terms of information systems. So you may have an accounting department and you are talking about operations that apply to customers, invoices, and so on. You may have a shipping department, and basically that department is autonomous from all the other departments, and basically it provides business methods that allow you to ship things. So the grainness, the scope of the services is in general more aligned with business needs than with very small features. When you have this enterprise service bus, in general, you have a process orchestrator, which means that somehow you have an application server or a place where you can deploy these files that represent a business flow, and this business flow basically corresponds to invocations in these departments and in these services. And as Paul has said, in general, you have directories of services. UDDI has the means to find and buy and sell services on the internet has failed. No one is doing that today. But from a point of view of enterprise application integration and from the point of view of inside an organization, in general, you do have directories of services and you do have a place where you can actually find the described services and the interfaces. Okay? So UDDI basically failed, has a general concept, but from an enterprise application integration and inside the organization, in general, that's something that you want to have.
Oh.
Yeah.
But you said that inside the organizations, UDDI is used.
Not UDDI, a service directory.
But that doesn't mean that when someone integrates a service from another department, they have to talk with the other department to make
a contract.
Yeah, a contract. Or
that's right. Of course, in general, when you have an organization and you have different entities, in general, you have to have an agreement that this guy is going to call this guy and this guy is going to do something on behalf of this person. What I'm saying is that in general, it's quite common to have a central repository where you basically have the definitions of what a service is and what a service means. Even if it's just in terms of the contract, which means the WSDL, the definition of the service. And there are actually discovery protocols to get this information. But again, we'll look into that in a little bit more detail in a moment. Okay, so what are the basic concepts in terms of service-oriented architecture? The idea is that your system is actually composed of autonomous entities, so you have these application silos which have a life on their own, and they act independently of the others. So again, there is, in general, no tight coupling between services when they are executing. The type of functionality that you offer for these services is coarse-grained, which means that basically you have methods that allow you to do macro operations and not thin kind of operations. And in general, when you have these services, these application silos, whenever you design an application silo, you tend to design what's called an integration interface, and that's what's called a service. Let me give you an example. I have a lot of projects at the European Space Agency, and every time they design a new system to put online in their production pipeline, in the ground system, one of the things that all contractors have always to provide is an integration API, an integration service. So basically there's a document called an interface control document, and that's the first document that is written. And that document specifies, this is what I'm going to offer to the world. Okay? And this is quite common in large-scale systems. What's the integration API that you are offering the world? A possible way of implementing a service-oriented architecture is using web services. That's quite common today, but it's not the only way. For instance, in banking systems where actually a lot of money is involved, as you know, it's very, very common to use message queues. Why? Because message queues are very, very robust. They were designed to have fault tolerance. They were designed so that the messages don't get lost, and they have a lot of mechanisms to ensure reliability. So again, web services are just one possibility for implementing SOAS. There are other ways and other technologies to do it. So in a nutshell, a service-oriented architecture in our context is composed of independent systems that execute autonomously in general. Whenever someone designs one of those systems, one of those application silos, they actually provide a service interface, an integration interface which is published. In general, in this kind of architecture, which is a hub-and-spoke architecture, you have a process orchestrator. This is a place, an application server, where you can deploy a file that represents the invocations that have to occur. And in general, you have a service directory. Although it's not compulsory, it's actually very, very useful inside the organization. Why am I talking about this, and why am I deviating a little bit from the general definitions that Paulo told you? One of the reasons is that if you don't design your system in a proper way, and if you don't think from the start how you want your system to be, what's going to happen to you is that you are going to get something like this. This is what's called point-to-point integration. And what this means is that you have this system, and this guy says, okay, I need to get some information that is on that system, and basically this guy integrates directly with that system. Even if that system is composed of web services, if you think about the system here, this one also needs to do things with other systems. So this guy ends up calling different things, and after a while, basically, you have a lot of interactions. No one actually knows what's deployed. No one actually knows what's running on each place, and so on and so forth. So from a point of view of enterprise application integration, you want to be more structured in your enterprise, because the maintenance costs of managing something like this, it's really a nightmare, okay? It's very, very costly.
Hey, Paulo, a quick question.
Sure.
So I understand what you're saying as a general paradigm. Is it ever the case that for perhaps performance or high reliability kinds of concerns, you may have a particular instance where you have point-to-point for very specific reasons in an overall enterprise system?
Yes, you do. So one of the problems that in general people run into is that this guy, the process orchestrator, is not very performant, let's say. And in general, it can be a point of contention, because this guy has to orchestrate all the processes for everything that is being submitted in the system. It's true that modern application servers and modern process orchestrators support clustering by default. So it's very, very common to buy a license that actually allows you to deploy the system in a cluster, but even so, it's costly. So in some cases, you actually have to do point-to-point integration, but as an overall rule, you tend to avoid that. And you tend to avoid that because of the maintenance costs in the long term of trying to manage something like this. Okay? So again, there is a quality attribute trade-off between performance and maintainability in this case. Okay?
Thanks.
Okay. Okay. So until you start to actually put your hands in the code and see what things imply, I know that this is a little bit confusing, because many times people say, okay, but the service-oriented architecture is just web services. So how is this different from remote method invocation or distributed objects with Corba? It seems really strange. And the main point that I want to make is that the point is not technological. The point is architectural, is how you deploy the systems, the kind of functionality and the granularity that you offer, and how you actually govern the overall system. And if you actually compare services to distributed objects, the model is a little bit different, because when you have distributed objects like in Java MRI, what happens is that you actually have the object, and the object has a certain identity, and basically when you are invoking a method, you are invoking a method on a certain object. If you have a service, you are not really that concerned with the identity of the object. In fact, you don't have the concept of an object. What you have is a business interface. So what you have is business functionality. Also, in terms of services, what you do is not to actually distribute it in function of computation. So if you think about remote method invocation and RMI, basically when you deploy the objects, in general you tend to put them on certain machines because they perform a certain function on those particular machines. When you are talking about services, what you are representing is the business function that a certain department offers. And the location of this service is not that important because the idea is that you have location transparency. So it may be running on this machine today, it may be on a machine with a different name tomorrow, but the idea is that you have this service which represents the business that you do, not really what's going on this particular machine. Encapsulation is at the interface level, which means, again, businesses, and not really at the implementation level. So you know that many times when you are designing distributed objects, you have this object and you have this interface, and basically you say, my object descends from unicast remote object, and basically everything that you have becomes a distributed object. The way you think when you design these systems is not really in terms of objects. It's in terms of interfaces that you are offering. In services, it's very, very common to perform interception and chaining of services. It's very common to have a call or a message that goes from this system to this system to this system, and that's intended. And in terms of distributed objects, that's not really common, because in distributed objects, what you are doing is method invocation. And in general, you don't think, I'm going to perform a method invocation on this object so that this object is going to perform a method invocation on the next object, and so forth. So, again, the middleware is not the important thing, is how you think about the services. It's very common to have routing of messages, and this routing is based on content and context. So if you remember the example that I gave you regarding the widget and gadget use case, basically you were routing messages based on what was inside of the messages. Again, you don't do that in general with distributed objects. And again, you have a high level of granularity, you have a high level of autonomy. Another thing is that, as I told you, whenever you think about services, you think about the interface and what you want to offer to the world. You are not really thinking on how that is done in terms of implementation or the kind of computation that goes inside that object. Another thing that is very, very common when you have services is that you have an agreement on the business model between different partners. So again, if I'm talking with a different department, I have to agree on a schema and on a data model so that we can integrate. If I'm talking with Walmart or Continente here in Portugal, I have to have a common scheme and I have to have a business model that has the same kind of vocabulary among us. This doesn't happen when you are doing distributed objects. Okay? So it's a different mindset.
Paulo, quick question on the data model. Is it the case that there are standards that are adhered to in given industries for the data model?
That's right. So one of the things that we'll cover in this course is standards for enterprise application integration. And for instance, you have an organization called OASIS that for different kind of business like supply chain, basically they publish a standard for what the messages should look like and the schemas should look like. If you look at another important standard, it's something called RosettaNet, which basically standardizes what the messages should look like for certain particular business. And that's very, very common. Okay. Okay. Why do you should want to use SOA? The main reason and the main driver in general is maintainability and evolution of systems. So again, the point is that most of the cost of software nowadays is actually maintenance cost. And if you don't think about the future, and if you start to do point-to-point integration, very, very soon you are going to run into huge development costs because you are trying to integrate with systems that were not thought for that. So again, if you are in an organization and deploying a system, sooner or later someone will want to talk with that system. So the first lesson that you should take is that whenever you deploy a system, you should provide an integration interface for that system, a service for that system. If you don't do it, sooner or later, what's going to happen is that someone is going to hack into your database, because that's the only way they can get the data they need, or they are going to hack through the user interface, or they are going to do something that is very, very messy. And what happens when they do that is that the assumptions that you had about consistency of your system, like if I have this record in a certain table of my database, I need to have this other record in this other table, is going to break. Why? Because the people that are hacking into your system don't really know about the assumptions on how your system were designed. So please do provide an integration interface for your systems. Another important thing is that if you actually design the system using a service-oriented architecture approach, basically it becomes much easier to add new services. Why? Because imagine that you have this service bus available. Every time that you create a new service, a new application, and you provide this interface, this service and this interface is automatically available to everyone. And again, if your business needs change, it's very easy, or it's relatively easy to actually define a new business process that uses these different services. Another thing that this helps you with is actually replacing legacy systems. Why? Because imagine that you have a system and you actually created an integration interface. If this system becomes obsolete, because you actually standardized on the business drivers and the business functionality, it's a lot easier to take this out and put a new system in. Okay? So again, evolution for the future is a key driver when designing these kind of systems. Sure.
You've been talking about integration between applications in terms of calling service methods, business methods, whatever, from system to system. Do you think as shared repositories could also work as communication between systems, or is that a little bit dangerous?
You mean shared repositories?
Shared repositories of data. So you don't call a service, you deploy data in some common format, and whoever needs to consume that, it's a read-only, let's say, shared repository, and they can read.
So some people actually do that. In general, you have a problem with the following. Many systems are very data intensive, but in many cases you actually have business functions that you have to do. So for instance, you actually have to ship things to clients, you actually have to generate invoices, and so on. Of course, if you have data, you can couple the systems using data, like if you put an invoice on the shared repository, others can read it, but somehow someone has to manage this repository, this common repository. How do you know when you can erase something, right? And if you have a shared repository, what you are doing is basically creating a centralized database for everyone, which doesn't really scale on the long run. João, can you?
Just a comment, and the problem with that is that you must know the rules, the business rules behind this data to do something. So it's not.
Yeah.
Usually, that thing, the shared repository, is used when you want to consume data from a data warehouse because the data is not live. They make increments of data daily. So usually, when you want to consume something from data warehouse, you use shared repositories.
Okay. So again, if you think about a data processing pipeline where you have the operational databases and you have an ETL process, an extract, transform, and load process to put data in a data warehouse, that can be seen a little bit like an application silo, actually. So the kind of functionality that you have is basically constrained in a certain business function. Now imagine that you actually want to offer some key performance indicators available for the whole enterprise. Basically, offering these key performance indicators could be a business function that would look into part of this data warehouse, generating and giving those indicators using a service. And this would be the integration service. Okay? Again, going back to Matt's question, a data warehouse and getting data from an operational database to a data warehouse is one of those situations where you don't want to use web services and you don't want to use a service-oriented architecture. Because typically, the extract, transformation and load process is something that has to run in a very tight time window, and basically it's very performance sensitive. So in many cases, what people do is actually to dump the data from the operational databases into the file system and basically import it into the data warehouse directly. Again, if you put something like XML in the middle, forget it. You are going to kill the system, okay? So when I'm talking about integration, it's even at a higher level than that, okay? It's across departments, is offering business services to across the organization. Okay? Okay, the importance of open standards. If I'm deploying a service-oriented architecture and an enterprise service bus, and if the idea of this is actually for it to live for a long time, because this is what's on the core of your architecture, this is not going to change. This is going to be long-lived. Why? Because if you actually decide to replace this infrastructure, this bus with something else, what's going to happen? Every single system that your bus touches has to change. Okay? So when you deploy this common infrastructure, it's really important to use open standards and something that is going to be long-lived. Why? Because the implication of replacing that is really huge. So nowadays, what happens is that everyone tries to use open standards for doing that kind of part. The common part where the systems talk with them among themselves should be done using things like XML, HTTP, SOAP, JMS, and technologies alike. Non-proprietary technologies, okay? Because they have to be long-lived. Sure.
As you're saying that it shouldn't be used proprietary technologies, what happens when you're trying to integrate a service with someone that makes standards like Magic, like Microsoft, that just keep changing stuff and that increases maintainability, right?
Basically, you have a problem. Again, these are the principles, but in practice, there is no silver bullet. So you can only aim to go so far, but at the point if the standards change or if people start to pollute the technology, you have to deal with it. Again, there is no silver bullet. You try to avoid it, and as a software architect, what you try to do is to actually design a system that is able to survive as far as it can to that kind of change and problems. Okay? Actually, one of the things that we are going to see, not in this class, but in the next class, is that nowadays there are a lot of specifications and standards for web services. The problem is that no one is implementing a lot of those specifications, and some of the specifications are actually competing among themselves, which means that, well, people say, I don't know what standard to use, so I don't use any of those, and basically they rely on old technology. And again, there's a trade-off in this also. Okay, we've went through this. Basically, in general, when you are doing this, what you are doing is moving from tightly coupled solutions where, for instance, connection among systems costs you money, and when you are actually deploying objects and calling objects directly, this is function-oriented, and when you, in the past, try to do it, you try to design a system that would last forever and so on. To assist, and we are trying to evolve to a position that is much more designed to evolve, that is much more fought for the change, in which connections is not really the cost because you are doing point-to-point integration, but actually you can have some kind of process orchestrator where basically you can change the connections as your business changes. We are trying to move to a way which is not based on calling functions, but it's based on business processes, and in a way that is designed to be changed. So in general, what we are doing is moving from application silos, which are tightly coupled, to orchestrated solutions, okay, which are loosely coupled. Very quickly, again, in general, in your degree up until now, you mostly dealt with this part, which is the databases and the objects and a little bit the components. What I'm trying to show you and the type of assignments that you are going to have next is more concerned with this part of the spectrum. So today and tomorrow we are going to discuss service-oriented architectures based on web services. Today we are going to talk a little bit about what's called first-generation web services, which is the basic part of the web services, so HTTP, XML, XSD, WSDL, and SOAP, which is the basic technologies. On next class, we are going to talk about what's called second-generation web services, which correspond to the WS star specifications. So things like routing, secure conversations, policies, addressing, reliability, and things like that. Okay. To conclude, in terms of a bus, you have your autonomous systems. In general, at the center, you have some kind of orchestration logic, which uses these systems. And basically, on the front end, you have a certain number of user interfaces. A very common thing is for a process, one of the processes that is running here actually being initiated by something that happens on the user interface and involves several services. But it can also happen that these guys here basically call something here that has an impact and starts a business process that involves other systems. Okay? So to give you an example, this is a very old screenshot. This is a screenshot from this talk to 2003. And what you do in these technologies is that you have parts which represent these kind of systems, and basically you define orchestration logic and business processes, which are the things that run in here. Okay? Okay. Questions about this? No questions? Good.
On the previous slides.
Go ahead.
What is an application silo?
Okay.
Silo. I don't know what it is.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I can give you
It's
an
one up on the
example.
previous slides. I missed it there.
Okay.
I think from slide number 9.
Mm-hmm. So let me show you an application silo to give you an idea of what it looks like. Okay. So your next project is actually to design an application silo. An application silo is an application that performs a certain business function, but only that. So if you look at this, at your system, you have a user interface, you have a business logic layer, and you have a database layer. So this is an application silo. Now imagine this shipping department. In this shipping department, actually, the guys that work here also have a user interface, they also have a business layer interface, and they also have a database. So this would be a different application silo. And if you look at the organizations, you can have 10, 15, 20 application silos. And what you don't want to do is to actually couple them directly. You would like to have a process orchestrator for doing that. Okay? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about web services. I think that most of you, how many of you have developed a web service or used a web service? Can you raise your hand? Half of you, and at CMU? One person? Okay. Let's talk a little bit about web services. So imagine that you have 3 different systems. You have a web portal, you have a warehouse, and you have a billing department. And imagine that you have systems that are written in different languages, like the web portal is written in VB and ASP, God forbids. You have a warehouse, or the warehouse system is written in Java and J2EE, and the billing system is written in COBOL. That's actually very, very common even today. So if you actually need to use these guys, if you look at VB-ASP, traditionally the communication interface that they had was something called DCOM. In Java you have something called Java RMI, and in COBOL you could actually talk to a COBOL system using Corba. If you actually want to have these guys talking, you cannot really do it this way. So the idea or the reason behind the web services was to have something that is based on open standards and things that in general are working on the internet, which means HTTP and XML, and try to have a simple way of calling methods and passing documents around the system. Okay? So that this would be a common language for everyone. So what happens is that in general, a web service works over HTTP, the HTTP protocols that you have in web servers. In general, there's a protocol called SOAP. SOAP means Simple Object Access Protocol, if I'm not mistaken, which specifies what a method invocation looks like and what a return looks like. And these method invocations actually occur using XML. So you are sending a piece of XML to the other side and getting a piece of XML. So, a brief definition, a web service is basically an application that is identified by an URL, so HTTP something, and it can be accessed through the internet using standards which are open like SOAP XML. Again, what we are doing nowadays is moving from a stage where basically we have pure sockets and connectivity to a stage where basically we browse the web and we had web browsers to a stage where we actually use HTTP and the underlying protocols to actually transmit and program the internet. Very briefly, in web services, everything is represented using XML. The protocol being used is the Simple Object Access Protocol, which allows you to exchange XML messages amongst systems. And a very common misconception is that SOAP only works over HTTP. That's actually wrong. Actually, you can use SOAP over different protocols. So you can even do SOAP over FTP or mail. It's very uncommon, but the protocol in itself doesn't prohibit. Why do we use HTTP in general? In general, we use HTTP because it's open on the firewalls. So the sad thing today is that everyone has a firewall, and in general, it filters out everything because of security concerns. That's a good thing because it makes my system safer, but it's also a bad thing because actually all the applications send HTTP through port 80, which is not really like HTML, but it's really application data. I can tell you that some years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, when I was playing with this, I found out that my JBoss wouldn't work and my systems wouldn't work, and I couldn't figure out why. And the reason is that Skype basically opens port 80. It's not a web server, it's just a way so that Skype can get the messages in, which is really annoying. So if you are doing enterprise application integration and you plan on using port 80, don't use Skype at the same time, okay? Okay, so how do you define the services? How do you define the contracts? What are the methods and what are the messages passing on the wire? You do that using the WSDL language, the Web Services Definition Language standard. And finally, how do you know which services are available on an organization? There are several standards. One of the standards is UDDI. And as Paul said, for the internet, UDDI is dead. Inside the organization, it's still used, although there are other approaches to have directories of services, okay? Okay, how does this look like? It's very, very simple. So imagine that you have a client application, and you have a service application, and you have a registry. Basically, when you create a service, which is a class with a certain interface and so on, basically you deploy it and associate it to this service there's a service description. This service description corresponds to what methods are available and what the messages look like. You get this service description, this WSDL file, and basically you put it on a service registry, okay, somewhere on a well-known server. If I want to actually invoke this guy, I go to this service registry, I get this WSDL file, and basically I'm able to generate a little bit of code that allows me to invoke this service. So after I have the steps on this side, I can perform the method invocation here. One important thing, even when you are not using a service directory, it's very, very common on the same machine to have the service description, okay? So let me show you this in practice. Okay, this is something that you will have to do. So if you are using JBoss, it's actually very easy to create web services, and it's actually very easy to create web services associated to Enterprise Java Beans. I hope that you have already read the project assignment, So let me create a new session bin. I'm just going to call it, okay, the package I'm going to use DEI, which is our department. I'm going to call this calculator bin, which is going to be my implementation. And this is going to implement an interface called calculator. Can you read? Can everyone read on this side and at the CME side?
Yes.
Okay. So this corresponds to my interface, and let's imagine that I want to have a very simple thing. I want this to be a method which returns an integer and basically adds two numbers. Okay? So this is the interface I'm going to publish to the world. And now I have the implementation. Okay? And the implementation of this thing does something very, very simple. It just returns A plus B. Okay? If I want to actually have this as a web service, it's very simple. The only thing I have to do is to say, this is a web service. And this is a web method. Okay? And that's it. I can deploy this and I have a web service written and it will work. I'm just going to change a small thing. As you know, when I'm using XML, I have namespaces. And in this case, I'm going to define a namespace so that this is encapsulated into a nice package. So I'm going to call the package www.diucpt. Okay? So I'm going to add this project to my JBoss. I already have JBoss running here, as you can see. And I'm going to deploy the project. Okay, it takes a little bit of time. Okay. So let me open a browser for you to see. JBoss actually has an address. You can read this in the documentation, where it lists all the available web services. Where it lists all the available web services that you've created. So in this case, I have a web service called, in the namespace calculator, and it's called calculator bin. If I actually want to see the definition of this service, I can come here and I get a little bit of XML. Okay? We are going to look into this in detail. But the important thing is that this service description that I was telling you about and that can be published here is available in my machine, okay? And if I have this piece of XML, I can actually generate a piece of code to call my service. So let me do this. So,
Paulo, can I ask a question about that?
Sure.
So, a quick question first about the binding between the service requester and the service provider. Is it the case that with every call it goes through the registry, or is it bound?
No. So you only need the registry, you only need that file so that you know what to call. Okay? So that file is only used one time. It's the time where you actually generate the stubs, the code to perform the method invocations. From then on, all the calls are directly to the service provider. Okay? So
if a change is made, there's a mechanism for notifying the requester that a change is made and you need to regenerate stubs?
No. So you'd get an exception in that case, if it changes. So this goes back to Paul's talk. What we are doing is to actually binding the service statically, but you can actually do it dynamically. So it's possible to actually be sure of what's on the other side of the service. But that's not something that we are going to do here because it gets pretty complicated. Okay?
So I guess I'm curious about the benefit of the registry then.
So, again, the registry, the thing is that when you are doing web services, no one gives you a piece of code and tells you, okay, this is the piece of code that you need to use to call me. What people give you is a contract, and this file is basically...
Right. The description.
This file is actually the description, the contract of your service. So if I need to invoke something on you, with this description, I can generate the code I need to call you. Okay? And again, in some business scenarios, you actually get descriptions like this one, which are standardized. Okay? So the advantage of the registry is that, again, if you think about a large organization and you want to know what's available, and if you have the permissions, basically you can get the description of the services that you need, and you can call them directly. And this is actually very important for the process orchestrators, because basically you point it at the description of the service, and you get all the bindings and all the parameters that you need to perform the invocations. Okay? Let me just turn on the air conditioning because this room is starting to get really hot. Give me a second. Okay. So let me show you this in practice.
I wish there was a...
So I have a web service that is running on my machine, and now I'm going to generate the code that I need to talk to this web service. Okay? So the way I do this in Java is very simple. I write WS import. I pass it the address of the registry where the WSDL file is, or if I don't have a registry, the address where the web service is published. And if you look, I have a interrogation mark WSDL, and when I do this, basically it gets the file and it generates a piece of code that I can use to actually call it. Okay? So let me show you how I would do a client for this. So I'm going to create a new project. It's a very simple project. It's a Java project. I'm going to call it calculator test. Okay, I need to close all this. I did a mistake. Okay, and I'm going to create a client. New class. I'm going to call it my test. Okay? Okay, so how do I use that code? It's very simple. The code was generated here. I'm just going to add this to my project. How did I call it? My test? No, calculator test. I'm just going to create a library folder. Okay. So for it to be used, I need to configure the building path. So add class folder. It's called live. And now I can use the code. So basically, the code that was generated, if you look at it, it has things that look quite similar to the methods that I have. So I have an add class, add response, a calculator bin service, and so on. So how do I do this? It's very simple. Calculator bin service. Okay. I need to get the part. The part is the calculator itself, so so I get the service. The service is all the operations that are available. I get the particular calculator, and now I can do something as simple as calculator.add 10 with 20. And calculate the result. So let's see what happens. Okay, let's execute this. Sorry. Wrong EDI. So what I just did was actually create a web service, publish it. I got the description of the web service, which is a WSDL file. I generated the stubs, and basically I've used these stubs to actually call the web service. Okay? It's very, very simple. Of course, an advantage of this is that I can do it in any language and across platforms. So this is Visual Studio. And if I want to actually use this web service, can you read what's written? The font is a little bit... does anyone know where to change the... Oh, it's here. Where? Okay. Okay. So how do I do this in C# and .NET? Again, it's quite simple. Add web service reference. I need to get the description of the service. And now look at the interesting thing. And this goes back to Matt's question. When I press go, it discovers that there is a service called calculator bin service. And there's an interface called calculator bin. And there's a method called add. Okay? And I'm doing this, it's not dynamically, but at runtime, okay? So let's call it, okay, so now I have the reference. How do I do this? Using So how do I do this? I have a calculator bin client, which gets me the service. This is not Java anymore, so things are a little bit different. And basically, to call the service, what I need to do is service.add. And the way it was mapped to C# is actually a little bit different. So it has a class called add, which was automatically generated. So the input parameter is going to be a class called add, which has 2 arguments. What are they called? Okay. So I'm going to add 20 and 30. And this will take care of the invocation. How do I get the response? It's very simple. Add response. And now I can write it out. So remember, the web service is running in Java on JBoss. I'm calling it from C# in this case. So about to invoke the web service, the result is 50. Press any key to continue. Okay?
Well, we were discussing interoperability between the 2 languages. I think that C# only generates that class called add because it's a Java service. Because if it was a C# service, it would generate. So there's a problem here, right?
Yes and no. Okay, that's a very good question. So what happens is that what C# is doing is actually interpreting directly the contract definition, which was generated in a different language. And if you look at it, what happens is that you have something called a calculator bin. It has an operation named add. It has an input message called add, an output message called add response. So in this case, what C# is doing is basically looking directly of what JBoss generated and generating the classes in that way, because the tools are not really that well integrated. But there is no violation in terms of interoperability, because as long as the contract is unambiguous, it may not look 100% right in one language, but you can still call it because it's standardized. Okay?
Yes, the problem here is the tools. They don't work that well.
Yeah.
And if you have for example, an error, Java usually puts the error in a specific field of SOAP, but C# doesn't do it like that. So you won't be able to use the generator.
Yeah. Again, things only go that far, right? And that's why they pay us to debug code and to write code, right? So, but again, the point is that at least you have a common understanding and you are able to actually generate code on both sides and invoke methods on both sides. Okay? Any question? There's a question? No.
Well, I have one follow-up question. If this gets going too far off track, just let me know. But I'm still trying to understand the trade-off between having the registry versus having the service description. on the service provider. So from what I understand, the basic advantage is transparent, is location transparency. So you're not needing to bind the location of the service provider to the service client, and because other than that, the service description could be either on the provider or the registry. Is that right, or are there additional advantages to having the registry?
No, that's completely right, and it's actually the main advantage. So if you go back to this figure, imagine that you actually have 10 different departments in your company, and these departments have their systems running and so on. Now imagine that their system, the machine where the service is running, changes from being my customer to my customer B. Okay? If the description, the WSTL, is directly embedded in the same machine, basically you don't know how to find the machine. Right. And what happens is that if you have a service directory, which you keep update whenever you change the location of the machines or if you change the contract, it's a lot easier for people to understand and locate where the services are and the interface is available. Also, one of the things that we look at is this process orchestrator. And what happens with this process orchestrator is that, in general, when you are defining the business processes, you need to specify, you need to know the services that you are calling. So, in general, you don't want to bind directly to these guys because in many occasions you don't even know where they are at a given moment because, you can have 10, 20, 50 of these descriptions, and basically you just want to be here and to have a description of what's going on, independently of the physical place where they are. So, again, the main advantage is really the location transparency.
Yeah, so I understand that. They're just, when you say that you don't know where they are at any given moment, because they're bound statically, they're not likely to change day to day. This is more of a, if you acquire or restructure some more infrequent changes.
That's right. So these guys are not changing, but remember that you may actually have business processes and new business processes coming in and out every day. So imagine that you work for a telecom operator and you are having a campaign where basically you are discounting something and you need to actually perform some kind of strange operation to run a campaign. You may be using new services and removing new services from your business processes quite frequently. And in general, you don't want to be trying to locate where the service is at every given time. You need to have a place like some kind of yellow pages that tell you, okay, I need to talk with the billing department. Okay, that's where it is. Okay? That's the main advantage. It's a place where I can find my services. Okay. Okay, so let's go quickly over this. The basic web services stack, let's call it that way, is HTTP on the bottom. XML has the data, not data model, but data meta model or encapsulator being used. The invocation protocol is SOAP. Services are described using WSTL. They are typically registered using UDDI, but other options exist. Okay? So, how does SOAP look like? I'm not going to go in a lot of detail in terms of this. Basically, when you use SOAP, you have a message a little bit like this. You have something called the SOAP envelope, which is a global tag. You have a header. This header can have multiple entries, and one of the things that we'll see in the next class is that the several protocols corresponding to web services are implementing using different type of headers, and basically you have a payload, and the payload corresponds to the body element, to the body tag. In general, you also have something called the fault element, which is a tag which is filled when you have a problem and some problem occurred. Okay? Let me give you an example. This is what a request looks like. For instance, I have the SOAP envelope that I told you about. In this case, I don't have any header, but I have a body. And the body corresponds to an invocation called getProductDetails. And if you look, the reason why the server knows what getProductDetails means is that there is a namespace and a schema associated to this. And the product details that I want is of product ID 827635. Okay? So what I'm doing is kind of a method invocation using XML. And in response to this, the server would send something like, again, an envelope with a body, a text saying get product details response, the result, and it would give you the text corresponding to the product. Again, what's on the wire is basically XML, and in many cases, it's actually XML documents being passed. A quick note, and this again is a deviation from normal kind of web services to more service-oriented architecture kind of functionality. In SOAP, there are 3 types of nodes, 3 types of machines that can be involved. You always have a sender, you always have a receiver, but as I told you, it's quite common to have transformations in the middle. So there are some nodes called SOAP intermediaries to where the messages can be routed and transformed. Okay? So if you want to have these service intermediaries, basically you have a value in the envelope where you specify the role of the node and you say next. What this means is that this message should be processed by the next node and the next node and the next node. An important thing also is the type of messages that you are sending, the payload. And this is really, really an important part. You have 2 major types of messages or encodings. You have what's called RPC-based, and when you are using SOAP with RPC-based messages, what you are doing is a true method invocation. So the XML that you are passing to that machine says, call this method with these parameters and get this response. It's a true method invocation. And from a point of view of enterprise application integration, in general, that's a bad thing. Why? Because from a point of view of enterprise application integration, in general, I don't want the systems to be coupled, which means that I try to avoid to have remote method invocations with responses. In general, what I want to pass to the other side is actually an XML document, like an invoice which has the tags describing what I'm buying, who I'm buying it from, what are the products, and so on. And if I want to send someone a document, an XML document, I need to encode the document saying it's a document-based SOAP invocation. What this means is that the tag looks a little bit like this. Send document, and document is basically the file. And when I receive, I have the equivalent of a receive document, and I'm not really processing the document. Okay? Going into a little bit of more detail, when I when I specify document, and this is one of the annotations that I can put in the code, and what this means is that of the message is it's an XML document, and it can actually be validated across an XML schema. Okay, I'm really sending a document. The other option is document literal bare, and this is only available in Java. Okay, so in general, you should be a little bit careful about this. And what this means is that it's still an XML document, but the Java runtime is going to map this into a Java bean. A Java bean has, it's a class which has get and set methods. It has a public constructor, and it can be serialized. Okay? Why do they have this? Because it's a lot easier to deal with classes with properties and get and set methods than to deal with documents. Okay? The other option is RPC literal. Again, this is very used, but from a point of view of enterprise application integration, is really not that great. In this case, I'm not passing a document. I'm just invoking something and getting a response. So it's basically calling methods. Again, XML schema validation doesn't really apply in this case. It's not really a good thing. RPC encoded, I'm not going to go over this. Don't use this. This is a nightmare. It's deprecated by everyone, so don't use it. One important thing, in many systems, you also need to send binary data. Let me give you an example. Imagine that I have a service that sells stock photography, so I can buy photos, right? It doesn't make any sense to encode a photo in terms of XML, right? I'm not going to describe the byte saying X010, X020, X0 something. It doesn't make sense. When I actually need to send binary data across systems, like a JPEG file, in general, what I use is something called SOAP with attachments. What this means is that I have my SOAP message, but basically it has a pointer to a piece of data which is encoded. We'll cover that in the next class in a little bit more detail. But please don't encode binary data inside of XML. That's really bad. Okay, I'm not going to go into this into detail. JBoss also supports something that is very, very useful, although it's not standard. So JBoss has something called message style endpoints, and what it allows you to do is to actually get the bare XML directly. So imagine you could write something that looks a little bit like this. Get the invoice element client, which would return an element. And this element is actually, like in JDOM, the root element of an XML file. This is very useful because I can process the file directly. But again, this is not standard Java, so if you want portability, please don't use this. Okay? If you just have to work with JBoss, this is something very, very useful. Okay, we've covered SOAP messages. So, what's the main problem with this, with all this, with SOAP? Can someone tell me?
The overload of the XML?
Yeah, it's a nightmare. It's heavy, it's heavy, it's heavy. Let me give you an example to try to make it extreme. imagine that you just need to send one byte to the other side, the age of a person or something like that. Something which in a normal remote method invocation it would take 2 or 3 bytes of payload or of dozen of bytes. If you try to send 1 byte of information, well, first, you cannot really send that byte. You have to represent it as text. So if it's 32 bits, a byte of 32, sorry, if it's a number of 32 bits, you are going to spend at least 4, 5, 6 characters to represent it. But then, basically you have to encapsulate it with tags, right? And you have to encapsulate the response or the invocation. And then you have to have the body block. And then you have to have the envelope, right? And then you are going to put this inside the SOAP. And then you are going to put this inside of the HTTP message. So you need to send 1 byte of information and you get something this size. Now imagine, so in today's class this morning someone was complaining that they were doing the second assignment and they had this XML file which was 3 megabytes in size. And basically NetBeans was crashing because of those 3 megabytes. Right? It's a little bit crap. Right? So what happens? If you actually have XML and you want to process this, it's not just that piece of data. You actually have to represent all this in memory. You actually have to have the APIs to navigate across the tree in memory. Again, you are spending a lot of CPU. You are spending a lot of memory. You are spending a lot of money in general and bandwidth in the networks. So again, be careful about how you design these things. As you may remember from the discussion last time, some people actually moved away from web services and are trying to use more lightweight things. Things like JSON with REST using HTTP, things like the old XML RPC model, and so on and so forth. I can tell you that, for instance, Google even uses something completely different, which is called Google Protocols. Some people are using some other lightweight representations for these things. But again, if you want to have a unified language, web services are a way to go. Okay, I'm almost done, not quite, but almost. So, as I told you, what's the language that you use to describe web services? Use WSDL. This describes only the service interfaces, and in general you need, in WSDL you have 3 things. Well, more than 3 things, sorry. You have 4 things, 5 things, okay. But basically you have the data types being used. So imagine that you have a data type named client. The data type is actually defined in the XML, okay, in the WSDL. Basically, you have something which are the messages that can go in and out of the system, which means the parameters, and they are also described in the WSDL file. You have the port types. The port types, in fact, represent the services available, the methods, let's say. You have the bindings. The bindings, it's the protocols that are supported. For instance, SOAP over HTTP, SOAP over email, and so on. And finally, you have the service bindings, which means the actual machine where the thing is running. Okay? To give you an example, a WSDL file looks a little bit like this. You have types, closed types, and you have the data schema here. basically you say which are the parameters that go in and out. For instance, you can have something called ESBN, which is actually of the type string, and I can use it as an input parameter or output parameter. I have a complex data type which has a title and an author. Again, this is going to be used either as an input parameter or output parameter. But when I define the parts are actually the messages. So in this case, I have something called a catalog, and I have a method called getBookByESBN, okay? And I say, I have an input parameter called ESBN number, and the message is the ESBN number that I defined here. And I have an output parameter called result, and the message that I get is the book info, which is defined here. Finally, I can say that I'm going to send documents, which means that whenever I use this service, I actually get a piece of XML that looks like this and this, which means it's a proper XML file that I can process in my program. That's what it means, binding style equals document. The transport layer that I'm using is HTTP, and it's going to be mapped into something called /getBookByESBN, okay? But then, after I have this definition and this binding to the protocol, I need to say in which machine this is running, okay? And in this case, what I'm saying is that I'm documenting the service saying this is the Acme Books catalog. I'm giving it a name. I'm saying this is the binding I'm using here, which is HTTP, and this is located on this address, okay? So this represents the complete contract regarding this service. If you think about, actually this could be in a completely different machine. So I can have a service definition here, and I can tell, okay, this service is available there, okay? Okay, this is the example. In many cases, you don't need to deal with all that stuff. So in general, you don't need to actually be looking at these definitions like what I did for the example in class, okay? In practice, and you don't need to deal with that because you have tools like the WSTL import that I've shown you. WS import is the one in Java. In C# you use WSTL directly. And these programs basically generate you the steps to process this information. In practice, my experience is that many times, you actually need to look at the schemas, you have to debug the schemas, you need to try to understand why it's crashing, you need to look at the SOAP messages that are going around the network. There are even tools to intercept the SOAP messages being exchanged in the sockets because debugging these things is a little bit hard. I can tell you that it's actually harder than in the past where you used things like remote method invocation or Corba or SunRPCs. It's a little bit more messy than that.
I was going to say that sometimes you have to generate the stubs by yourself. You have to write them.
Yeah, that's true. Sometimes you have to do all the planning by hand. Again, that's life, and tools are evolving.
Yeah, but in the beginning it was even harder. Nowadays we have several tools to help us, and I believe in the future.
In the beginning, I don't know if any of you used the first version of Axis. Axis is a standard tool for web services in Java. Oh my God, it was really bad. It was really awful. Lots of XML, lots of things to deploy in different places. It was a really nightmare. Again, things are evolving and will keep on evolving. Okay, UDDI. We are not going to cover this in detail in this course. Basically, UDDI is a directory for web services where you can query the services available and get the descriptions. As I told you, the initial vision, probably 5 or 10 years ago, was that everyone would be selling services online and it would be great, and you'd go to these huge UDDI directories and it would be a lot of fun. That didn't materialize. Companies didn't find the need to have centralized UDDI directories. And the reason is a little bit what Paul was saying. Basically, if I need to use a service, I just Google it, and somehow I find the page where the WSTL for that service is, which is typically in a certain page of the organization. After I have the WSTL, which is published by the organization itself, I can invoke it directly. So people didn't find the need to do this. But if you think about, Google is 11 years old now, and UDDI is 10 years old now. So the vision at the time is that you really needed this kind of directories. Having said that, again, if you are working inside an organization and if you have a lot of services available, different departments, many machines, it's actually useful to have a directory service for that kind of things. Let me give you an example. I don't know how many of you have worked in large organizations, but in terms of authentication and things like that, most organizations have an LDAP server or a variation of that. For instance, Microsoft has something called Active Directory, which is in the back end is actually an LDAP server. Why? Because if you have to support, let's say, 1,000 people, you want to have a centralized place with the description of the persons and a centralized place where you can do authentication and so on. And the rationale and the interpretation here is exactly the same. If you have a large organization with tens or hundreds of information systems which have business interfaces, you don't want to be, let's say, messing around with each one of them. So in general, it's useful to have a place to look up. So basically today we covered basic web services. On the second assignment, on the second project, you only need to use basic web services. Basic web services are things that are described using WSTL. The invocation protocol is SOAP, and basically you can register them on a centralized UDDI directory. The very, very last thing that I want to tell you is one of the biggest problems that prevents or annoys people, which is actually Carlos' point: interoperability. So the main motivation for using web services was actually to have different systems all talking the same language. In practice, it's a little bit more difficult to do than it seems, and this is a recurring theme. There are problems regarding interoperability, but as Paul was saying, there were some advances in this regard, and in particular there is a an organization which publish these things called profiles, saying if you are compliant with the WSI profile 1.0, you have to implement this protocol, and this protocol in this way. Besides that, they not only tell you which protocols you have to implement, but they also have test suites, which means that if you want to be compliant with a certain version of WSI, you have your system, your web services stack has to pass a certain number of tests. Let me give you an example. If I go to my Visual Studio, IDE, and I say I want to create a new web service application, let's call it XPTO, which is and I do OK. If you look at this, you will see this line. And this line, what this says is that this web service conforms to WSDI profile, basic profile 1.1, okay? Which means that Visual Studio is trying to make the best effort possible to generate code that is compatible with this standardized organization. To give you an idea of what the basic profile 1.1 is, which is the mostly used one nowadays, basic profile 1.1 says you have to implement all these protocols. So you need to have SOAP 1.1, HTTP 1.1, you need to have an RFC which allows you to do state management. You need to comply with the XML 1.1 and XML schema part 1 and 2. You have a certain definition for the WSTL, a certain definition for UDDI. You need to support encryption using HTTP over TLS, TLS 1.1, SSL 3.0, and certificates X509. So again, the tools, if they are compliant across, if they say we are implementing this profile, this means these protocols are supported. And actually, if you are invoking a service, you can query and know which are the profile that they are supporting. Okay? So many suppliers actually tell you, for instance, Sun in the, okay, this is an old slide, but Sun Application Server 8.1 said we are compliant with Profile 1.0. If you go to Microsoft, you will see in their products we are compliant with Profile 1.1 or 1.0 and so on. My advice again is that if you are doing this for an organization, if this is going to survive for a long time, this is really the kind of things that you also have to pay attention. Okay? The standards should be long-lived, and you should try to use things that are standardized and several tools can use. So, questions, comments, personal attacks? Any questions, guys? Is there any question on the CME side?
I have a real quick question. Why would you use SOAP for RPC? So I know you said it's not a good idea, but why would you do it at all? If you're going to do RPC, why would you use SOAP?
Because one of the reasons is that you don't need to deal with those nasty XML schemas and so on. And actually, if you are doing RPC, basically the tools actually generate you the methods with the proper method names and the proper input and output parameters and return values and so on. So you just need to code the body of the methods in many occasions. If you are doing document literal, in many circumstances the tool is not able to give you a method to actually do it. So I can tell you from my experience, a lot of students actually try to put RPC literal in every single method because the tools in general don't complain about that, because they can generate it.
But I guess my question was the other way around. If you're going to do RPC, why use SOAP rather than doing RPC without SOAP?
Exactly, because of interoperability. So again, thinking about a large organization, if you are going to do RPC, you want to always do it in a standardized way, using open protocols and so on. So
we're talking platform interoperability.
Yeah. Okay, guys, please start to do the second project, because the second project is it's larger than the first project, and it's actually harder to do. So please start to do the second project. Thank you. No class next week, remember. Okay?